Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Marcus Kimbrough, and I am Vice President for Partnerships and Advancement here at Levine Museum of the New South. Welcome to tonight's program, What's It Going to Take? Housing and City Planning. I would like to take a moment before we begin to thank our sponsors, Corning Optical Communications and the Infusion Fund, a partnership between the City of Charlotte, Foundation for the Carolinas, and generous donors who support the arts and cultural sector for making tonight's program possible. If you wish to support the museum in its effort to offer engaging programming, content, and experiences, please follow the link in the comments section to donate. We would love your feedback about tonight's program, as well as your suggestions for future topics. Feedback helps us make our programs better. In fact, it was one of you from a previous program who suggested the 2040 plan as a topic for discussion. Please click on the survey link in the comments section for a very short survey at any point during the program. We are also excited to share with you our new app and digital experience, No CLT, where you can delve into the story of Brooklyn either on foot, in Second Ward, or from your home. The experience recounts Brooklyn's history through narration, photos, poetry, and the voices of former residents, a history that very much reflects what tonight's program is about. To learn more about it, please follow the link in the comments or visit our website. This evening, we will be hearing from our panelists about the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan, a roadmap that will guide development and investment over the next 2 decades. This roadmap is long overdue since Charlotte's last comprehensive plan was in 1975, but it has stirred debate about gentrification, affordable housing, and the impact of city development policy on various communities. In our typical Levine fashion, we will begin by grounding our discussion in history, and our panelists will help us better understand how we got to where we are currently. Now, on to our panelists. We are lucky to have Mary Newsom as our moderator for this evening, a lifelong newspaper journalist who spent several decades at the Charlotte Observer as an editorial board member and columnist. Mary retired from the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute in 2018 as Director of Urban Policy Initiatives. Joining Mary, we have Angelique, a research associate at the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute. In this role, she conducts various research and evaluation projects in the Charlotte region, ranging from housing to youth development. In addition to her research, Angelique directs the Urban Institute's City Walks program, which engages residents in community conversations about their neighborhoods. We are also joined by Elly Portillo, who has lived in Charlotte for over a decade and is now Assistant Director of Outreach and Strategic Partnerships at the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute. From 2009 to 2019, he was a reporter at the Charlotte Observer, primarily covering business, real estate, and local politics. And joining them, we have Ismaail Qaiyim, whose unique background as a community organizer, policy researcher, and freelance writer adds depth and clarity to his work as a community-based attorney. He is a leader within both the Charlotte Community Benefits Coalition and the Charlotte Housing Justice Coalition. To learn more about our panelists, please visit our website. And now, let's start the program.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And obviously, I worked with Angelique and Elly. I have not met Ismaail before, so I hope we can meet in real life at some point soon. Thank you all for being here. I want to start off by saying that it's important to remind people of something about city plans in Charlotte, which is that unlike some other places, if a city plan says something, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. A city plan is essentially just a guideline, that says, moving forward, we will try to make our policies and decisions meet these goals. But that, doesn't always happen. And I've heard a lot of discussion in the community that, well, the 2040 plan says this, so that's what we're going to do. Well, we hope, in many cases, we hope that's what we're going to do, but that may not happen. I want to talk a little bit about history. And I think that our first presentation is going to be from Angelique Gaines. And she's going to basically set the context for us. This is where we are now. Angelique is a researcher, which means that she looks at the data and she figures out how does this have meaning. So she's going to give us a data presentation about some of the conditions in our city today.
Well, thank you, Mary and Marcus, for that introduction. First, I'll provide a little bit of an overview of the Institute and what we do, and highlight some of our research, which speaks to the history of housing policy, as well as where we are now as it pertains to home ownership, as well as renting. So the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute is an applied research and outreach unit of the university, and has been serving the Charlotte community for since 1969. The Institute provides a range of services, including research and analysis, public opinion surveys, technical assistance, and training in operations and data management. The Institute also houses the Institute for Social Capital, which one of the 36 integrated data systems in the country, and manages the Quality of Life Explorer, which highlights social, housing, economic, environmental, and safety indicators in Charlotte and Mecklenburg County. So now let's get to the research. So the Racial Wealth Gap Charlotte-Mecklenburg report was released in 2019 and highlights the policies which has led to housing inequities and gaps for residents of color in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. The first picture you're going to see is one that looks at urban renewal. So you see the Brooklyn neighborhood and demolition that's taking place. So urban renewal was a practice which demolished and cleared mainly non-white neighborhoods with the promise of better housing that never came. A local example is the Brooklyn neighborhood. Urban renewal demolished and displaced over 1,000 Brooklyn families and displaced more than 200 Brooklyn businesses. In urban areas like Charlotte, largely non-white neighborhoods that were redlined, they were also divided and demolished for federal and local highway development. These highways were almost always routed through low income and minority neighborhoods, creating disconnections from opportunities that exist today. So we talk about urban renewal, and then that's also transportation policies that divided communities as well. And then this picture is from Hoyt's dissertation that informed federal housing policy. So the federal policy we speak of is redlining, which was a federal practice of rating neighborhoods based on perceived financial risk, and then systematically denying loans or services such as insurance in the areas marked in red that were perceived as too risky for investment. So non-white communities were redlined, preventing the flow and benefits of investment, depressing housing markets, and limiting the home equity that Black homeowners were able to build. And if you look at this map, to the left, you see the red line map of Charlotte. On the right, you see the current map of Charlotte's homeownership rate. Homeownership rates in Mecklenburg County continue to reflect redlining practices enacted in 1930s. Areas once deemed too risky for investment because of the racially driven policies still have the lowest homeownership rates in 2017. So you see how past policies still have a ripple effect and impact what's going on today. Policies such as redlining left historic African-American neighborhoods economically devastated. So past policies have, as we mentioned, have explicitly shut people out of wealth building opportunities and safe and secure housing, resulting in a wealth gap. White-headed households have 10 times the wealth of Black-headed households and 8 times that of Latinx-headed households. And from our study, we have learned that a variety of things. One being that wealth is multifaceted. There are multiple paths to asset development. Wealth does not encompass income alone. It also includes value from home ownership and other assets. Wealth is also cumulative in nature. It develops over time and is passed down from generation to generation. Lastly, wealth is structural. Each of these asset paths are marked by historic policies and practices which have allowed some groups to accumulate wealth while excluding others from doing so. So policies such as redlining, which we mentioned, urban renewal, and transportation policies. So where are we now? As of 2017, just over 2/3 of white households in Mecklenburg County owned a home, followed by Asian households and then Black and Latinx households holding 42% and 38% respectively. We also wanted to highlight some data from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg State of Housing Instability and Homelessness report, a report completed by the Institute and Mecklenburg County. And of those that do own homes, a large share of Latinx and Black owner households were cost burdened between 2011 and 2015, meaning they were paying more than 30% of their income for housing. 44% of Latinx homeowners and 36% of Black homeowners were cost burdened compared to 23% of white homeowners. This study was conducted in 2019, so it does not reflect the new data coming soon from the census, but these trends will likely not change. If anything, they might be magnified by the current housing situation and the shortage of affordable homes. For renters, more than half of all Black and Latinx renters are cost burdened and pay more than 30% of income towards housing. In 2017, there were a 27,000 unit shortage that were affordable and available to households that make less than 30% of the area's median income. When we look at evictions, eviction filings increased for the third year in a row by 12% from fiscal year 2018 to fiscal year 2019. So you see from all the culminating data that there is disparities based on race. And I'll kick it over to Eli for the next part of our presentation.
Yeah, hello everyone. I just wanted to talk for just a couple minutes about the 2040 plan and just bring up something that I know we're going to get to and really dive into. But I think it's fundamental to understanding the debate about our future here. And that is the question of how much influence the past has on where we are now. I think that Angelique just did a great job of laying out where we are right now, how we got here, and how the policies of the past, the quite recent past in many cases, have left certain communities disadvantaged and certain communities more likely to be advantaged with things like owning their own home, having more wealth, and having greater pathways to wealth. I think that this debate over whether we are kind of all at an even place now and we need to proceed like we are, or whether we need to really pay attention to how we got here, what is, lying beneath the inequalities we see now, really came out during the debate over the 2040 plan. I think it was especially crystallized in one moment during that debate when Charlotte Mayor Vi Lyles said, this basically wasn't that long ago. I'm paraphrasing what she said here, but a man in a suit came down and had a bulldozer and knocked down the houses in Brooklyn, and I saw it. Whereas City Council member Ed Driggs said, none of us who are in power now were in power in the 60s. So, we don't need to be proceeding that way. And I think that exchange between them really crystallized that debate over whether we need to try to rectify the sins of the past or move forward as though, everything is at an equal starting point right now. And more than duplexes and triplexes versus single family households or any of those other factors that came up during the 2040 plan debate, I think that is really kind of the core question that we're going to spend a lot of time digging into tonight.
Thank you, Eli. Thank you, Angelique. And Eli, I brought along a prop. I don't know if you can see it. This is the hard copy of the 2040 plan. So if y'all haven't read it, I'd say, get a comfy chair and a lot of beverages and dive in. And Angelique, you and Eli both, but especially Angelique's pictures, painted a really good image of the ways that actions in the past have influenced where we are today. And it's not just government policies. Urban renewal was a government policy. Redlining started as a government policy, but then the government kind of stopped its official redlining, but the private homeowner insurance companies continued. You couldn't get homeowner insurance, even if the federal government hadn't redlined your neighborhood. And then you have the private individuals. When people who lived in Brooklyn or the Greenville neighborhood, their home or along the route of I-77, when their homes were taken through eminent domain, they had to find places to live. So they began looking to the neighborhoods, the then predominantly white neighborhoods in the kind of ring around Charlotte. And those neighborhoods were the Belmont neighborhood, Villa Heights neighborhood, Optimist Park, Seversville, Wesley Heights. And so then the private real estate industry got involved, and they would go door to door and knock on people's doors and say, don't you want to sell because Black people are coming? Although they often didn't use the term Black people. So this was how private individuals continued the government policies. The point of all this is to say it's very complicated. It's a very complicated situation. And I'd be interested in hearing maybe from Angelique, in your opinion, how do you think the goals in the 2040 plan, how could they be used to rectify some of the consequences that we're living with?
Yeah. So first, I think the 2040 plan needs to lift up and look at further examine these past policies, not ignore our past, but see what has created inequalities and come up with structural solutions to rectify them. It also calls for not only one area or sector of our community to do this work. It calls for combining solutions across sectors, so private, public, nonprofit, that we all have a part to play in creating a more equitable place to live, work, and play.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say I think that reducing residential segregation along racial and economic lines is one of the most probably important things that we can try to find strategies and ways to do to correct some of these past inequalities. I think that also some of the goals in the 2040 plan speak to the kind of multifaceted nature of this, 10-minute neighborhoods where you can access goods and services without driving very far, where you can walk to places. That is really about transportation and land use development. But that also ties back to what we were talking about with urban renewal, where you had giant highways that came in and were built through historically Black neighborhoods for the most part and divided the city. So there you have an issue where mobility and undoing some of those past transportation mistakes can also get to undoing some of those past urban renewal policies that we're talking about. So it's really multifaceted. Just one more quick thing. If you look even at the tree canopy in Charlotte, we have a lot of trees in this city. It's a great city for tree cover, but they're not equally distributed. You know, you can go to neighborhoods in Southeast Charlotte, like where I live, where there's great lush tree canopy everywhere. And you can go to other neighborhoods, historically lower income, marginalized communities, where there's much less tree cover. And that is an example of, you know, how historic disinvestment is still reflected today. And I'll stop talking now because I could talk about that for a while.
Well, thank you. We'll give you an opportunity to keep talking in a little bit. Before I get into the next question, I do want to remind the people who are listening in, please put questions in the chat, in the comments section, if you have questions that you'd like to ask any of our panelists. So Eli, you obviously followed the city council's discussions on the 2040 plan pretty closely. And there was a lot of discussion about one particular piece of it, which was to basically in neighborhoods that are now zoned single family only, to allow the building of duplexes and triplexes and maybe quads. I can't even, did quads end up being still in it, or are they?
Only on main roads.
Only on main roads. But the point is not that you couldn't build a single family house, but that you could also build a few other kinds of houses. And so on one side, people said, well, this will increase the supply of housing. And through the law of supply and demand, that will then help alleviate the problem of housing that people can't afford. And other people worried that it would lead to even more gentrification. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that policy playing out? And others jump in after Eli if y'all have thoughts.
Yeah, so, you know, I think that was one of the most controversial parts publicly. It definitely attracted some of the most attention. As you said, the thinking behind the planners was, hey, if we allow people to build more houses, if you want to build a duplex, if you want to build a triplex, that'll increase the supply, help bring down cost. People who were opposed to it really came on two fronts, and that was there were some neighborhood activists from lower income neighborhoods and some city council members who represent, like East Charlotte and some parts of the city that are already facing a lot of gentrification pressure. And they said, well, if you let developers just come in and build duplexes and triplexes, they're going to do it in these neighborhoods that are already seeing a lot of redevelopment pressure. You know, the Seversville, Biddleville, they're going to come in and demolish them even quicker now because they can build more unconstrained. And then you also had pushback from neighborhoods, single family neighborhoods saying, you know, we don't want more density. We don't want more duplexes and triplexes. In terms of how it will play out, the Charlotte Business Journal looked at Minneapolis, which was one of the first cities that enacted this change a few years ago. And they found that there were only a few dozen duplexes and triplexes built last year. I think it's really going to be market driven. Frankly, if you look at the neighborhoods we're talking about, there's already a ton of gentrification pressure. There's already a ton of demolitions. People are coming in and demolishing neighborhoods and building single family houses. I mean, look at Cherry. Hardly any of the original houses are there now after 15 or so years of a huge gentrification wave. So I don't know that duplexes and triplexes will accelerate that. At the same time, I also don't think you can automatically say, well, duplexes and triplexes will lower housing costs. I mean, I used to live in Dilworth for about a decade, and they build duplexes in Dilworth already, even before the 2040 plan. They're just called duets, and they cost $1 million each. So not necessarily affordable, even as it increases supply.
Thank you. And if anybody's interested in seeing how the value of the land affects whether the housing is affordable or not, drive down Providence Road, essentially from Wendover Road out, and you see these massive duplexes they're still allowed on corners even now. And these places are like $1 million units. They are not what we would call affordable housing. Does anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah. I agree with what Eli said. I think in reference to the 2040 plan, I think the 2040 plan is very much a laudable, I think, attempt to really, think about equity, think about development, think about how all of these things can be done in a way that is equitable and in a way that is ultimately accessible, right? I am with one of the community coalitions, right, that initially came out. I wouldn't necessarily say we were opposed to the idea of the plan, but I think we were very much taking the historical long view and looking at the fact that many promises have been made, particularly to Black and brown neighborhoods and marginalized neighborhoods, and these promises really, don't amount to very much, right, for a lot of different reasons. And so what we would ask ourselves is okay, we have this idea, this plan. What can we actually kind of do to ensure that there's some follow through on the more aspirational aspects of the plan that could make Charlotte like more equitable, could make Charlotte like more accessible, right? And I think to the point that Eli made, when we think about increasing the supply of housing, I mean, there is a lot of housing being built in Charlotte. It's just that the housing is at market rate and it's not being built to accommodate the greatest need for the supply of housing. Of course, that's people at or below 30% of area median income, right? So we're in a situation where we have a hot housing market. There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of capital pouring into the city, right? And there's no kind of regulation on price. There's no kind of regulation on rent. There's no regulation on any of that. So what we see is there'll be an increase in the supply of housing, but the increase in the supply of housing is just going to drive gentrification and drive inequality. So for us, with the Community Benefits Coalition and the Housing Justice Coalition, we very much believe that communities and neighborhoods, particularly and especially those that have been marginalized, really not only have to be involved, but have to be really driving this process forward. Really, communities have to understand why this stuff is happening, the economics, the politics, and really be organized. And it's really only through neighborhoods and communities being united and being organized that we can really see a different outcome.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Do you have any thoughts about what specific policies, do any of you, I'll throw this open to all of you, what specific policies the city might enact to help bring about some of the ideals that we're talking about? And how do you stop gentrification? How do you help people afford a place to live? How do you create a 10-minute neighborhood? There's a lot of things in there that, anybody want to jump in on that?
Sure. I'll take it. I mean, I think the first thing really is to, number one, like understand the totality of this process and what it is, right? And so, the comprehensive plan, like you said earlier, is a plan. It is sort of an aspirational policy vision, but there are other aspects of this process which will have, more teeth, primarily the Unified Development Ordinance, right? Which the first draft of the Unified Development Ordinance is basically going to replace most of the existing zoning code for the city. And the first draft of that is going to be released in October. Another thing to think about, of course, is the policy mapping, right? And maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, but the policy mapping is basically going to sort of, create a map of the city based on sort of like different, they're not necessarily zoning districts, but they're basically like different kind of like use commercial neighborhood districts. And that's going to pretty much overlap with the UDO. And what I'm saying basically is that this process that's happening right now is a process that's going to pretty much affect the way Charlotte looks from now going all the way forward. So I would say, I know we're asking about very specific policies, but honestly, it's very difficult for those policies to come into fruition if communities and everyday people are not engaged in the process and are not aware of all of the other things that are going on. I guess the last thing I'll mention is, of course, like the city has launched, partially based on the organizing of the Community Benefits Coalition, a group of neighborhoods in the city. The city has launched two commissions. One is the Equitable Development Commission, and the other is the NEST Commission, which is focused on stability and anti-displacement. And these are two commissions right now, which individuals can apply for. The deadline is August 27th. And so these commissions are going to be making like direct recommendations to the city, one more so about development, and one more so about development, and one more so about issues of displacement and equity. And so they're there's different criteria for different individuals that want to be involved. But I think these are like some of the specific mechanisms that exist right now that are going to, I think, determine what the plan ultimately amounts to. We want to ensure that, people understand these things and people are aware and people are engaged.
Yeah, I think, I would add that a lot of the inequalities we see now really trace back to home ownership, and a lot of those policies that we've been talking about really go back to who is advantaged to own homes and who is locked out of that. So, if you just put it in concrete terms, someone who lived come back from World War II, get the GI Bill benefits, buy a house, you have middle class life after that, that plays down for generations. If you take the same soldier returning and, it's a black soldier and say, hey, yeah, you can't buy a house in these neighborhoods. You don't get the same benefits, because of de jure and de facto segregation. That also plays out for generations. So, if we talk about policies, I think we have to look back at that original disparity that we're talking about here, and that's really home ownership. So a lot of our affordable housing policies have focused on building new rental housing. The whole tax credit program is very complicated, takes a long time, builds rental apartments, and that's where a lot of the city's housing trust fund money goes to. So, I think we need to probably look at ways to promote home ownership for more people. Because if we're talking about these huge wealth disparities, that's where so much of that traces back to. And, I don't know that we solve a lot of these problems going forward without addressing that in some way.
Interesting question just popped up in the comments from Ted Follett, longtime housing legal aid law attorney, who I happen to know, and he's one of my heroes. But he's asking a question, and in fact, I was going to bring this up because I think a lot of people don't realize this. But although in many places, a community, a city, a county, whatever, can require X% of the units in any new development to be affordable to whatever level of poverty they choose to put into their law. North Carolina does not allow cities to do that. Cities or counties, they do not have authority to do that. So we're kind of hamstrung in that way. And
yeah, and that did make it into the 2040 plan as a sort of an aspirational goal for the city to pursue in the future. It's tough to see that happening at any time in the near future.
I did also want to say that one thing the plan does have in it are, of course, community benefits agreements, which, of course, the Community Benefits Coalition, that was one of the primary things that we really pushed for and organized around. And I think as a direct result of us organizing and pushing, right, if you look, the Community Benefits Coalition is mentioned as a stakeholder in the plan, and there's much more detailed language around it. But a community benefit agreement, if you think of it as an agreement between a community and a developer, whereby a developer provides certain benefits to the community, right? Typically in exchange for the community agreeing or not opposing the development. And this is a way for communities to directly leverage power and influence the decision-making process around development and what is being built. And so we're cognizant of the limitations of state law, but we understand that, again, organized neighborhoods, right, where the city is helping to facilitate this process really can push for benefits from developers. And the other side of it too is that there's public investment. I mean, all of these policies in the past, urban renewal, the city did that. The city can choose where it invests its dollars. The city can choose, who it sells its public land to, right? The city can choose, if the city gives incentives to a developer, right, public money, the city can attach conditions to that public money. So we really think that there is a lot the city can do, and we really have to really push the city to really use its public money, use its benefits process, use all of these things, in addition to organizing communities so that we can create benefits and communities can negotiate and push directly with, negotiate with developers and push for development that is inclusive and equitable and allows particularly marginalized neighborhoods to enjoy the gains, right? That come from growth instead of, us always being pushed out or, having to sort of struggle through it because our neighborhoods are no longer affordable.
And I thank you. And I wanted to just mention one point. Ismaail, you mentioned the UDO process, the United Development Ordinance. And it's really easy for everybody to get psyched up about a plan And when you start talking about the actual ordinances that will carry it out, everybody's eyes glaze over and they decide they'd rather go watch the Panthers play. So this is just a hope that those of you listening will, grit your teeth and get into that UDO process too, because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where things will either happen or not happen. And it's boring, but do it.
It's a good point I think you made, that a lot of this stuff, in addition to, the statistics Angelique went over, there's a lot of numbers and statistics and a whole alphabet soup of jargon around land development. But in the end, it translates into these real tangible effects we see. Just this morning on WFAE Charlotte Talks, the topic was why there are drastically different life expectancies in different parts of the cities, different parts of Charlotte. There are neighborhoods where that are mostly predominantly Black and lower income, where average life expectancy is 12 years lower than wealthier white neighborhoods. And that's not just, some crazy thing that happens. That's because there's different levels of public investment. There's different access to amenities and greenways. There's different access to pharmacies. There's food deserts where there aren't grocery stores. People don't have the ability to go to the doctor necessarily if they don't have insurance. So, this stuff is all really abstract and can sound kind of hard to grasp. I mean, I have been following this stuff for years and it screws with my head sometimes, but it really translates into things as concrete as people dying earlier in parts of the city.
Very good point. And you brought up something about the ability, to move around the city. And so I wanted to segue into the concept of what the plan calls 10-minute neighborhoods. It basically has a goal of encouraging neighborhoods where you can really access a whole lot of things by walking, by bicycling, or taking transit, so you don't have to drive. And the underlying point is that the transportation is a piece of affordability, because it comes out of your household budget. If you're driving, long distances to get to a job, that's money that you can't spend on a house or on the rent. Angelique, you had talked about, you'd been interested in talking about the 10-minute neighborhoods. How do you think the city could make those happen?
So in terms of transportation, and so 10-minute neighborhoods, having all the resources in one place, bringing and investing in businesses to come to an area, invest in different resources, community organizations to come to an area, making things more accessible to the residents that live in the neighborhood. I know development in the South could stretch things far and wide, but really promoting place-based initiatives, investing in communities, I think is important in creating those 10-minute neighborhoods.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the premier examples of urban renewal in Charlotte is the Brooklyn neighborhood, which was in Second Ward, where most of the government buildings are today. And I think this can be the frustrating thing. I'm not an urban planner. I'm not an architect or anything. I'm a guy who's written about this stuff and followed it mostly as a journalist in Charlotte. I think the frustrating thing is it seems like we spend a lot of time trying to recreate things that previous policies destroyed. Brooklyn at the time in the 50s and 60s, when the urban renewal policy was really set, if you go back and read there, and I'll put in a plug for UNC Charlotte, the Atkins Library has a great collection of original records, the Charlotte Redevelopment Commission records. I'll see if I can drop that in the chat after this. At the time, it was called a slum. It was called dangerous. Policymakers called it dirty. And, there was some substandard housing there. Yeah, there were people living in bad conditions, but rather than helping them, they just decided to knock it all down and put the government center there. Well, what was that? It was a neighborhood. It was a 10-minute neighborhood. It was where you could walk to the store and walk to the local doctor. And it was a segregated insular community because that was the law, but it was a 10-minute neighborhood by every definition the city has. So now, on so many dimensions, we're trying to recreate something that was destroyed by an earlier policy with the new policy we have now.
I think, in a lot of cases when we talk about things like development and transit, we really always, we tend to kind of like not look at history as much, which is, I guess, that's the point of this conversation. But as Eli mentioned, there's a long history of sort of transportation being the thing that really spurs displacement and the destruction of communities, right? Before it was obviously done, through urban renewal, through the creation of highways. And I think now what we're really seeing is, this conversation around transportation, we can't really have it without looking at the light rail, right? And looking at particularly the Silver Line is now proposed and being developed. And as far as I know, has kind of been rerouted around sort of or through to like downtown Charlotte, and may even be cut from the airport. But I think when we look at the Blue Line, what do you see when you look along the Blue Line? What you see is really the development of like market rate luxury apartments, right? Like that's what you see. And again, this goes back to an issue of public investment. This was an opportunity, right, to actually build not only housing that was affordable, but housing that was both affordable and accessible. A lot of that land was, publicly owned land. There were massive like public subsidies for the Blue Line, right? Many of the people who voted for the creation of the Blue Line were themselves African Americans and other people that may be in danger of displacement because of how it was constructed. So, when I talk about history, I'm not talking about just the distant past that we can't do anything about. Like history is like the Blue Line. It's the light rail. We can all go out and look at the light rail and see what that is and what that's resulted in. And it doesn't have to be that way, right? Like this is an example of building transit so that you create a city that is accessible, right? And where people can get to work and do what they need to do, versus building transit as a means of basically just attracting more and more direct capital investment into the city and, exploding in market rate luxury housing that ultimately, right, like whether or not everybody can actually, get to work and do what they need to do in a logical manner is really like secondary to how much investment you can really get. And a lot of these projects, I go back and say this, are heavily publicly subsidized. And that again, that means that there are ways that communities can put pressure on the city, can put pressure on the county, right? And put pressure on developers directly to really like go in a different direction. And this process is happening right now with the Silver Line. Right. So this is all live. This is a very real conversation. But I just wanted to throw that in there just to, make that point.
Yeah. And just really quickly, I want to say, I think that gets to another tension, which is a lot of times when we talk about who needs public transportation, we're talking about lower income communities. If you look at the demographics of CATS, it's very skewed towards lower income communities, people of color. And I don't want it to be a thing like, we don't want these things to be built because, of gentrification worries. I think sometimes there's a tension where it's like, do you not try to improve mobility options in neighborhood because you're worried about that? I think we need to find a way to do stuff like build the Silver Line because that will help the city as a whole while also not fostering displacement. And I don't know how you balance that. I just think it's a tension that comes up in these conversations a lot.
There's a tool that some other places use that's called value capture, because anytime you do a transportation improvement or any kind of improvement, really, the property value goes up, which means that the tax revenue generated by that property goes up. Mm-hmm. And so there's an idea that if you could take that increment and use that increment to help make the place a better place. And what's the definition of better? Well, one example might be to have better housing, not better housing that is affordable to people. And just a little piece of, because I've lived here so long, a little piece of history. When the light rail was first proposed, everybody thought it would fail, and that nobody would want to live near it. And so they had to sell it based on that people will want to live near it. This will be an improvement in our development, and this will encourage development, and which makes the bigwigs, the money people, love it, who might otherwise not have liked the expenditure of tax dollars. But at a certain point, it became clear that it was, yes, people wanted to buy it. And the policy didn't change at that point to, wait a minute, they are going to want to develop along it. How do we keep how do we keep this from not ruining the neighborhoods? And how do we keep it from making the housing unaffordable? And the city could have probably years ago said, okay, let's figure out how to build more affordable housing along the light rail. And I think they're now noticing that, but to me, it's a little bit late in the game for that. There was a really good story in the Observer, by the way, about Optimist Park by Will Wright and Gavin Off about the change in Optimist Park. Angelique, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, so just touching on that, maybe a possible solution would be to set aside homes or rentals that are affordable in these more high intensity, close to transit communities, just to create a more equitable, diverse, mixed income community. Oftentimes, the current housing inequities that exist make it more difficult for residents to stay in rapidly changing neighborhoods, especially if the cost of housing increases and people are already burdened, as you mentioned. So an increase in investment improves the infrastructure within the neighborhood. However, the investments and redevelopment that cater to the wealthy, that cater more to the wealthy population and ignore the needs of long-time residents that have been there for decades, further increasing inequity. So being intentional, catering to a diverse group of residents versus one type of resident would potentially create a more equitable housing system.
Right. And I definitely agree with that. I mean, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is why hasn't that happened right up to this point? Like, why has this pattern continued? And again, like I'm from Clinton Park, like that's where I live. I'm from West Charlotte. I wasn't in Charlotte. I went to law school in New York. I wasn't in Charlotte. I was in New York when the Keith Lamont Scott protest happened, and I saw when the protest happened, it didn't make sense to a lot of people, but it made sense to me. I was just like, oh yeah, of course, it's totally happened here. Charlotte is like that's like my perception of Charlotte. It's like, it's just people trying to survive and get by and struggle. I mean, that's like, like coming from the neighborhood I came from. And so, but I think to myself, like, historically, people have been able to gain benefits generally in the system through social movements and through mass organizing. I mean, that is the civil rights movement, that is the labor movement, that is what allowed for, the pressure from the labor movement allowed for a lot of the government policies after coming out of World War II, even before World War II with the New Deal. It opened up pathways for middle-class home ownership, but it's always been through a very much, a sort of direct mass movement of people, right? And that's, and the reason that is because this happens because there is no incentive for those who are wealthy and those who benefit from the system to do anything to really change it. I mean, offering, that, like, for example, after the Keith Lamont Scott protest, there were many different task force. There were many different studies about inequality in Charlotte. There were many different, the Urban Institute has done many different studies, like examining all these issues. There were many different sort of policy oriented solutions. But at the end of the day, if there's no political pressure, no political will, the comprehensive plan, all these things will just be words on paper and it'll just be business as usual. And we're the CBC Housing Justice Coalition. We're at a point where that's unacceptable. We're at a point now where communities are standing up and people are organizing and we're coming together. And, we are, pushing for and spearheading a movement here in the city for affordability, for equity, for access, for racial justice, for wages, for everything. And we say it unapologetically because it needs to be said, right? A city doesn't get to be to this point without certain people in positions of power and certain actors really just kind of, being able to really like dominate the politics. And so I view this through the lens of politics, because at the end of the day, that's what this is. And if there's no political pressure, if communities don't organize, particularly marginalized communities, and really bring our voices to bear, then things are just going to get worse. They're not going to get any better. And that's for this issue, for development, or for many other broader issues within our society.
I'm looking at the clock, and I'm thinking we've got a few questions in the comments that'd be interesting to ask you guys. So I'm going to do kind of a lightning round, if you will, ask each of you. So what do you think is the most important step the city could take, and a specific step, not just a feel-good proclamation that we're for social equality? What's a specific step the city can take to better ensure social and economic equity? If you were advising city council. Okay.
So I think the first first step would be to ensure all residents can afford a safe place to live. Ensure future policies do not create additional burden on residents or populations most vulnerable, whether that be financial, additional cost burden when changing development increases their property value or increases rent, or social, being displaced and segregated to one area of the city. As we mentioned, federal highway policies cut through communities of color. How do we prevent history from repeating itself, from us putting forward policies that create additional burden on our most vulnerable residents?
I would say there are a couple of things. I mean, in terms of direct things the city and the county can do, start with public investment. I mean, start with public investment, start with publicly owned land, right? So if we, for instance, like if you don't like the Midwood Cultural Center is which is owned by the county, right? I mean, that land is, under contract to be sold to a developer, right? Along with many other properties in Midwood, right? I mean, the city has resources. The city owns land still, right? Like this land can be, could be, sold to the West Side Community Land Trust, or this land could be, set aside for neighborhood organizations or for, marginalized communities, right? I mean, and that's just the land. That's not talking about things like tax incentives, right? So the city can basically can sort of foster a program whereby it reroutes a lot of this investment and this funding directly into communities, right? Through the various incentives that it often provides for development deals. Like that's a very, very, very clear, easy, direct thing that can be done. I mean, and the city actually does do this, but oftentimes it happens in the wealthier parts of the city, right? So I think in 2020, there's a rezoning in Ballantyne, right? Whereby the economic development department was able to negotiate directly on behalf of the residents of Ballantyne with the city for benefits. This is, again, when we talk about community benefit agreement, this is an instance where this happened. And so oftentimes those neighborhoods that have the clout and have the access are able to kind of leverage, this ability to really reap benefits either from third parties or more from public investment. But we really need that process to be made available to everybody. So that starts with public investment, and that, of course, the use of community benefits agreements as well.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think the ability to leverage public investments, if we're going to be spending billions of dollars on transit, if we're going to be spending hundreds of millions of dollars on things like Panthers Stadium, we're putting money into areas like redeveloping Eastland Mall. I think to the greatest extent possible, if the city and county could leverage those and try to, control land around them for, below market rate housing, convince developers who are getting subsidies to include below market rate housing. I think that is an area where, despite North Carolina's laws about local control and what the state controls and what the city can and can't do, anytime the city, the county, other local governments are spending money, that's a lot of leverage. That's a lot of leeway. That's where they can really kind of do what they want if they set the priorities policy-wise there. So I think that would be the single most influential thing that they could do at purely the local level without, going to the federal government, the state government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
A couple of questions from the comments, and one comment. James Bellows just notes that National Geographic did a great story on tree canopy in Los Angeles, and then he wants to know if the plan addresses food security and food deserts. And I'm guessing Eli knows the answer to it because you've probably read the whole plan.
Oof, I wouldn't go that far. I've got 2 kids and I have hobbies too. So, the plan does, say food insecurity is an issue that should be addressed, including 10-minute neighborhoods and grocery in 10-minute neighborhoods is part of it, equitable development, more equitably spreading that. But, there are still pockets of Charlotte where there's only convenience stores accessible. The Urban Institute, our parent unit, is working on a project to try to address the food desert in West Charlotte and the West Boulevard corridor. But, people have been looking at that for decades. The plan, I think, will be more successful at addressing that if, the city, the county, et cetera, are willing to look hard at things that haven't been done up till now, like subsidizing grocery stores, those kind of policies that are, maybe a little more out there than just changing zoning to allow commercial development. So yeah, kind of is my answer.
Stephen Valder asks, can eminent domain be used particularly, especially for large parking lots and car dealerships near transit lines?
Mary, I feel like you want to address that. I know you have thoughts on that.
I think the city and the county both have been very reluctant to use eminent domain over the years. I think partly it's expensive and a long drawn out legal process, and partly because it hacks people off. And, if you're an elected official, you don't want to be hacking people off left and right.
I think kind of addressing those things on the front end, like not allowing rezonings that allow giant car dealerships next to light rails or, car washes next to light rails. I kind of think the city is much more likely to address that on the front end than to go back and try to use eminent domain to take something that's already been built for the reasons Mary cited.
But let me just note that their track record's not good on not allowing that kind of stuff near transit stations. You were going to say something, Ismaail.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, it goes, again, it goes, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it goes back to the point. Let's just imagine, let's say, even if the city did do that and was willing to do that, right? Again, like the city has and the county, they have land that's available. And I understand there are a lot of pressures, there's revenue, all these other things, but like that land, what's to say that land wouldn't just be, sold to someone who would then turn around and build something like that, right? Or most likely would be sold to someone that would build luxury apartments or an entity that would do that. So again, I just reiterate the point about the political pressure and really pushing, I think, our public entities to really directly invest dollars into neighborhoods that really need it and haven't really had it, for a long time, such that people in our neighborhoods can benefit.
And Ken Szymanski, the retired executive director of the Charlotte Apartment Association, which I think is the Charlotte Regional Apartment Association, in the comments, he notes that the city's neighborhood development department did come up with ways to include affordable housing at light rail station areas around 2000 and 2003, but the city never put any money into basically to give them incentives to do that. So
yeah, and that's an issue that that I wrote about when I was a reporter at the Observer. That came up with the Blue Line extension as well. So even following that initial decision, and yeah, I think you heard a lot of kind of regret from local city council types at the time, like, oh, we missed the opportunity to bank land for these priorities along the Blue Line extension. So, now I think it's really a test of policy to see what will happen with the Silver Line.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. And had a comment from Vicki Jones of the Belmont Neighborhood Association. Just look in the comments if y'all are interested. She points out that there have been some comments about the history of that neighborhood, and that there are the neighborhood has a history walk that talks a lot about the neighborhood, and they and she sends the link along if anybody is interested in taking part. Yeah, that's a neighborhood that Parks Helms, the former white county commissioner years ago. He grew up in the Belmont neighborhood when it was a white neighborhood, and then it transitioned. And now it is transitioning back. It's a very mixed neighborhood, mixed income, mixed racial neighborhood. And way back at the early on, one of the questions was, I thought this was a very intriguing idea. Lynn Kojak asks, has the granting of lower mortgage rates to the financially disadvantaged been explored? I don't know. Do you guys know? I mean, currently, I don't think mortgage rates could possibly get any lower.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say mortgage rates are record lows or close to that anyway. I know the city of Charlotte has some down payment assistance programs. I think that's something that would be interesting to see expanded more. If you just look at the average price of a house now in Charlotte, I think it was almost around $400,000 last month in the Charlotte region. And, at that level, if you need even a 10% down payment, that's 40 grand cash. I mean, that's a lot of cash for someone to come up with for the average Charlotte house now. Is getting a 1.5% mortgage versus a 3% mortgage going to make that difference? I mean, I think it's really the price and the down payment needed that's a bigger roadblock.
However, things will not always be the way they are now. So that, I think that's an interesting idea to kind of tuck under our hats. And just to kind of show that things are really complex and the world is a messy place. We're all kind of assuming that home ownership is the ticket to solve the wealth gap, but there's a lot of evidence that homes in majority Black neighborhoods are valued at less than an equivalent home in a majority white neighborhood. And that sometimes Black homeowners are more apt to be the ones who lose money on their home investment compared to more affluent white neighborhoods.
Right.
Just throwing that out there because life isn't simple.
Right. And also, I mean, that's a really good point. And I think like it gets to, because you talk about housing and then you begin to really talk about like issues of like wages and then the long time, the racial wealth gap. There, a lot of people, even in the financial crisis, a lot of people who, lost their homes, they had really, really high mortgage payments, or they had like, adjustable rate mortgages and other things like that really hurt them. I just want to plug, there's a book called In Defense of Housing that I really would recommend people kind of check out, because I think it gets at a lot of these questions of whether or not home ownership really is this like golden ticket to like, a sort of stable, like American dream, so on and so forth. And we're in a world where home ownership is increasingly less and less available and less tenable for a lot of reasons. Especially we have corporations that are buying up homes and building, and leaving them as homes for rent, right, and other things of that nature. So, but I highly recommend In Defense of Housing. I just wanted to plug it, and I think it gets to a lot of where we're coming from, in terms of the Housing Justice Coalition and a lot of the kind of the fundamental issues with housing. And our thing is housing is a human right, should be available to everybody. Everybody should have access to it regardless of their ability to pay for it. So I just wanted to plug that.
Thank you very much. And I'm guessing that the audience has already read the Color of Law, but if you haven't read The Color of Law, that's another book that will just open your eyes to the depth of discriminatory practices that have been carried out in this country over the last centuries.
I just saw the comment at the bottom. Yeah, what's up, Mr. Bello? How you doing?
AP Human Geography teacher. I love it. Did you play football for him at Sedgefield Middle?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did.
Oh, cool.
Eighth grade. Yeah. Mr. Bo Bello. I don't know if I should say that on, but yeah, it's good to see you.
That's great. Any other questions from the participants, or do you guys have any final comments you'd like to make? Because we probably need to be winding it up. Nobody can stay on Zoom for more than about an hour without going insane.
I would just encourage people to explore the resources that have been shared. The Racial Wealth Gap Report is available from the Urban Institute. You can check that out from our website there at the bottom. The resources that the Levine Museum has for Brooklyn, really cool. The Atkins Library at UNC Charlotte has all these original documents. And if you want to just really see some stuff that's pretty shocking in retrospect. I would encourage you to go read some of those original documents of how people talked about these neighborhoods at the time.
Thank you. And I think we're going to wind up unless somebody has anything else to say. And did Marcus want to come back and give his final benediction?
I just want to thank each and every one of you for such a wonderful and really meaty discussion. Mary, thank you for moderating and bringing us, around this topic. Angelique, Eli, Ismaail, all of you did a wonderful job of articulating some very touchy and delicate points and really making them very plain and simple for us to understand. And so we thank you for this discussion. And again, please visit museumoftheNewSouth.org for more in-depth information around each of these wonderful panelists and for more around this subject of housing within the city of Charlotte and the 2040 plan. I want to bring your attention to our next event that we have coming up. It's our New South of the New Southerner, the Swan case around legacy. It's really an additional case that we had. We're bringing in this one forward. We had this earlier in the year. That's going to be on August 31st. I recommend that you go to our website, museumoftheNewSouth.org, and register for that event as well. Okay, so just want to thank each of you again for a wonderful discussion this evening, and excellent job by all. And please, everyone, check us out in the chat, put more comments there, and we look forward to seeing you guys next time. Bye-bye.